All right, well, the hour has come. Okay, what I'd like to do is finish up the discussion that we've had in the last couple of weeks, talking about the alternative views or alternative bases for our sort of moral regulation in the Scripture, and contrasting the biblical ordering of things and our modern mindset and how we're trying to order things now in this world, how they make for those differences. I want to talk about two things. Number one I got to very rapidly last week, and that is how these different orderings of things privilege different people. Now, there's nothing unusual about that. Any kind of moral ordering is going to say yes to some things and no to others. It's going to advantage some things and disadvantage others. There's nothing unusual about that. But we do want to see who is getting the advantage here and who is being disadvantaged. And then I want to talk about how societies, and our society included, actually regulate morality, how it actually is done, so that we kind of understand, what the task would be to the extent that we should be doing this at all. Okay, so we'll talk about that. All right, remember that everything is based on these basic concepts. Sort of reviewing here real quickly, that sexual morality, not just sexual morality, all Judeo-Christian morality is built on two things. Number one, okay, the nature of human life. What has God created and put in this world? What you understand that to mean, what you understand a human being to be, is going to give rise to how we're supposed to treat one another and what would be considered good and bad, right and wrong, moral or immoral. And the second would be what the nature of God and God's holiness, and that gives rise to the whole first table of the law, how we fear, love, and trust in God above all things. But this is absolutely necessary if we're going to have discussions about what should and shouldn't be in our society. Then we have to start at the beginning, and that is, what are human beings? And if you don't start there, we're just arguing about rules. And if we're just arguing about rules, it's just kind of an arbitrary thing. We don't want it to be arbitrary. And so depending on what we favor or don't favor, what we vote for or don't vote for, what we support or don't support, has got to be rooted in what we think is really going on, not just what we personally like, okay? Let's see, I want to skip through. Okay. The Judeo-Christian moral order is built on this understanding of human beings, that God desires that human life flourish. And it is built on the particular understanding of the needs of human beings, that God desires that it flourish. And the sort of the basic idea here is the duty of human beings to one another and to God. Okay, its duty is the central thing. So in other words, if you are living and breathing, there are things that you are supposed to do, and there are reasons why you're supposed to do them, and then there are things you are not supposed to do, and again, reasons for that, and it is because God desires that human life flourish. Now, we have an alternative moral order that is now sort of, I shouldn't say on the ascendancy, it is basically seated in the seat now. But if you think about how people argue about morality today, and they do, when people say that we're immoral or not moral, we're not. We're very moral. It's just that the morality has changed. So what was a morality based upon human flourishing and a Judeo-Christian understanding of what a human being is now ordered on the idea that, without sort of respect for what a human being is particularly, although we can deduce a few things from that, the key thing here is individual well-being. Individual well-being, personal fulfillment. And this is based rather than on the idea of duty, what you owe to other people. It is based upon the idea of freedoms and rights, okay? What it is that you should be able to do. And almost all moral discussion these days in our culture revolves about what I have a right to do, okay? What you cannot tell me I cannot do. what you can or cannot make me do. All right? So it's highly individualistic. Now, the Judeo-Christian worldview is individualistic in the sense that it really values every single human being. And in that regard, our modern sensibilities of individualism are actually derived from the Judeo-Christian worldview, that every individual is important. But we would call today's understanding sometimes called a radical individualism, and that is everything revolves around you as an individual, and that's why your personal well-being is paramount here, and that your rights to do whatever it is that you want to do are paramount here. Last week, let's see. It's a little Freud up here. Satisfying sexual desire is necessary for well-being. This is a central tenet of sort of modern thinking about human beings. It's axiomatic. I mean, it's not something that you really need to argue. It's just assumed that a human being, in order to be healthy, has got to be able to fulfill their sexual desires, and that human sexuality is quite natural in whatever form we find it. Now, note that there's a huge difference here in what a human being is. The Christian worldview of a human being is obviously all those things we talked about, being created in the image of God, but also a corrupt version of that. So we are corrupted but redeemable. That's how the Christian worldview sees a human being, corrupted but redeemable. The modern worldview sees a human being in biological terms. We are the product of evolution, and therefore what is natural, not what God ordained, but what is natural is considered to be the key thing. So if something can be shown to be natural, then it is a good thing, okay? There might be some exceptions to that, but in general, what is natural is considered good, because human beings are not considered to be corrupt. We are just part of the natural processes that produced us, okay? So there's nothing corrupt about your sexual desires, because in reality, all sexual desires are on a continuum, okay? And it's all really natural. You'll see also those who are enamored with the modern worldview about human beings are also very enamored with all kinds of statistical analysis. They will look at populations, and they are looking to see what people do. And what people do then will be considered to be the norm. The norm is what people do, not what people ought to do. The Christian worldview is God has established what people ought to do, and that should be the norm. No, should be. Christians understand that it isn't. If you're going to ask what do people actually do, we're going to say, well, they fall short of the glory of God all over the place. But there is still a should. But the modern mindset doesn't really talk in terms of should. It talks about what is. And so you want to be in the bell curve somewhere, and they have a pretty wide understanding of what fits in that bell curve. Okay. We talked a little bit about what a normal sexual relationships look like on television today, and so we gave some rather general examples. But essentially, who and how you satisfy your sexual desires is pretty much negotiated between, I shouldn't say any two, among adults who can consent to whatever they want, and it's all about satisfying our personal desires and our personal needs. And so we see that we went through that a little bit last week. People move in together if they want to move in together. They move out if they don't want to be living together anymore. There's hardly anything that separates being married and living together these days. With the exception that if you get married, you might have, it depends on who you are, but for many people, the difference between being married and not is merely a fig leaf. Because anybody who says, well, we can get married, and if it doesn't work out, we'll get divorced, there's no difference between that and just saying, how about we just live together, and if we don't like it, we'll separate. There's no difference. Okay. Now, I talked last week and finished up, when we compare the Christian worldview, the Christian moral ordering of things, and sort of the modern mindset of that we're talking about, this moral ordering based upon personal self-fulfillment, the question is, who is advantaged by this modern ordering of things? Now, this is not conspiratorial. I'm not trying to say that there's a committee somewhere trying to cause some people to be advantaged and some people to be disadvantaged. I'm just taking a look at this, and we just need to ask the question, who does this favor and who does it not? And do we agree that those people are the ones who should be favored? Okay? So, for example, the modern mindset towards sexuality favors individuals over families. Families have no real rights in our culture to say to their children, you can or cannot marry this or that person, or, kids go off and have kids whoever they want, and then how many grandparents are busy raising their kids these days? Their grandchildren. It's very, very common. And then families are stuck with step this and step that and more steps and all kinds of, and these things happen. It's not that these things are overwhelming and should never happen. They've always happened. You've always had stepchildren, step-husbands, wives, and so on. That's not a problem. The problem is that these things are considered to be perfectly normal, and the families that are supposed to be putting up with this, it's just laid in your lap. So how do you, if you have a future daughter-in-law or future son-in-law, or a present daughter-in-law and a present son-in-law, but you have no idea whether 5 years from now this is going to be the same son or daughter-in-law that's supposed to be coming over for Christmas. And you have no say in it. It's just the couple will decide whether they want to stay together or not, whether they want to have children and then split up or not. So you have grandparents and aunts and uncles and extended families where you have no control over this. Now, I'm not really saying that the grandparents should control the children. What I'm saying is the children should live their lives respecting other people rather than just themselves. This idea that my personal well-being is the key thing here, and that my rights and freedoms are the key thing, privileges my right and my ability to do what makes me happy, regardless of what it does to other people. Okay? Rather than an obligation of duty. You have to stay married because it's your duty to your husband, it's your duty to your wife, it's your duty to your family, it's your duty to your children. We don't speak in terms of duty. In fact, it's considered really not very nice at all if you were to tell somebody, you mean we should stay married even though we're unhappy because of the kids? And the answer is, well, yes, of course. I can't think of a better reason why I would want two people that aren't happy to stay together. Now, better yet is, since you're stuck with one another and because your children are relying upon you, I suggest that you learn to get along. Maybe you'll even learn to love and like one another. But if you don't like one another, at least get along. At least be decent for the sake of everybody else that's relying upon you. Now, that would be looking at this thing from the point of view of duty. Our culture doesn't look at things from the point of view of duty. It favors the right of a person to free themselves from an obligation like that if it makes them unhappy, because it's more important that you and I be happy than that you and I do our duty. So, as a general rule, I think it is highly questionable that we would privilege and favor those who want to do what makes them happy over others who are depending upon them. I think that is a very suspect ordering of things. By the way, if you're going to focus on duty, are there going to be people that are going to be very unhappy in their lives because we won't let them get divorced or whatever else that we won't let them do, won't let them sleep? Are there going to be people who are going to be unhappy? Yeah. Can we fashion a world where there's not going to be anybody unhappy? Where everybody always is happy all the time? No. So you're going to have some that are going to be. I would rather favor those, okay, who are dependent over those who have the right, who have the freedom, okay. And that's a problem with this moral ordering. It privileges adults over children. I talked about this last week a little bit. Family court is a monument to the fact that adults are favored over children. that the children just get what is left after the adults are granted what they have a right to. So it didn't used to be that people would say, I have a right to a divorce. Divorces were things that happened. And they happened because things were so broken that they couldn't be put back together again. And it was just, it was just a sad fact of life in a broken world that sometimes this would be the case. But it wouldn't be discussed in terms of rights. My right to be happy means I have a right to get out of this relationship that is not making me happy. Well, then we get the rationalizations. Well, the kids will be better off in the end because really it'd be better, they will be happier if I'm happy. That's the justification that's used. It isn't true. I mean, it could be. I will grant you that two people that are so hostile and violent and ugly with one another that they cannot say a decent thing and they're threatening and being ugly with one, yeah, that situation might be, the kids would be better if the parents were split. Of course, we might say if you're that bad, maybe you both ought to be in jail. Maybe that's what ought to happen. But to justify that the kids would be better if we're really, really awful to one another does not justify you being really, really awful to one another. If the kids were coming first, then a parent would say, well, I'm going to be unhappy. So I'm going to have to learn to make the best of it. Because there are lots of things in life, folks, that we don't choose, but we have no choice, and they don't make us happy, and we have to make the best of it. Okay? This privileges adults over children. That is deeply suspect. The children have no choice in this. A parent who decides to have a child without the benefit of marriage has made a decision for their child and has subjected their child to a less than ideal circumstance. The child had no role in this. The adult was granted the freedom to do that if they want. Okay? Now, we'll talk in a little bit about what we do about that, but nevertheless, a moral order that says that's okay is a moral order that favors the decisions of adults over children. It privileges the current generation over the next, okay? Because we are living for ourselves and for our own well-being. Think historically about how much of life is geared toward making the world a better place for the children and the grandchildren and for the next generation. How much has been built in order that it may be built upon, rather than for the present generation to feel so fulfilled and happy. This moral ordering puts all the emphasis on the present day feeling good, rather than the investment of our time and energy and even the sacrifice of the stuff of our lives for the benefit of the next generation. A huge portion of every generation was designed to be sacrificed for the benefit of the next. And then the next generation was called to do exactly the same thing for the generation after that, just as we have all benefited from previous generations that did that. Okay? But when the moral ordering is all about rights and freedoms in order for us to have personal well-being, it's all about this generation now. Sexual libertinism favors the healthy, the wealthy, the beautiful, and the strong. Sexual libertinism. Libertinism. Okay? So if you're an exceptionally handsome or beautiful person, it's a lot easier for you to get along in this world if all you want is sex. Okay? But if what you want is a stable relationship with which you may build a life with another partner who will stick with you for the remainder of your life, even if you're not the wealthiest and even if you're not the most handsome or beautiful person, okay? Those people are lucky if they get what they need. Our society really favors wealthy people who can buy what they want, beautiful people who will entice what they want. But if you're not particularly wealthy, not particularly beautiful, not particularly having anything, okay, what do you do with sick people? I mean, you know, we do say in sickness and in health, but the sickness of one person, the chronic sickness of one person makes life really hard for a spouse. And if your first and number one goal is, I need to be happy, well, that may not be your idea of happiness. Do we favor allowing somebody in that situation to free themselves, or do we say no? So, you are favoring those who can over those who may be dependent in some way or another on others. The Christian moral ordering is there to protect human flourishing of all human beings, not just those who can. The modern meat market will tell you all you need to know about who it is that gets the girl, okay? Or who it is that gets the guy, or what kind of guy, or guys they get. There's just no sense of anything beyond, if you're very beautiful, the world is your oyster, okay? It privileges those who don't want to make commitments to those who do. I mean, it used to be that it was kind of a joke, but it wasn't a joke, that a woman simply wasn't going to sleep with a man without either a ring on her finger or the promise, okay? The man might break the promise, but the woman would at least pretend to make him. And if he breaks the promise, then what is he? He's a cad. Do we have cads today? How bad would you have to be a cad today? Now it's just considered ridiculous and old-fashioned that a woman would require that kind of a commitment. So we favor those who don't want to make a commitment. We say, we'll make it easier for you. But those who do want to make a commitment, note that the pool of people that a man might be looking for, if he's looking for a wife to spend the rest of his life with, is much smaller now than it used to be. And the pool of men that a woman would be looking for, who would want to make a commitment to last the rest of their life and build a family together, is much smaller than it used to be, because people don't have to make commitments to get what they want right now. And then by the time they figure it out, you know, a lot of the most fruitful years have passed for raising families and so on like that. But, I mean, that's because in our society we give a pass. We're perfectly happy with that. These people are living their dream and doing what they want, and why should we stand in their way? But it makes it harder for those who, no, we want to buckle down and have a family together. It's hard to find those people anymore. And it privileges the selfish over the selfless, which is kind of a similar thing to what I just said. Those who just want what they want, our society says, well, if that's how you feel and two people want to do it, then that's good for you, okay? But those who believe that the essence of life is doing one's duty to make the world a better place, even though it costs you an awful lot, that person is not favored in our society. They're tolerated. They might sometimes be, you know, a pat on the back. But I mean, what we actually favor are those who just want what they want. And so, okay, so any comments on this? Do you agree that our present moral ordering that our society is putting forward is favoring these sorts of things?
Just don't know how to change it.
We'll talk a little bit about that. I'm not going to give you the answer, but I'm at least going to tell you a little bit about the direction it's got to go. But so here's the thing. When you are discussing or arguing over the direction of our modern culture, it is much more fruitful to discuss it from this point of view. What is a human being, and what do these contrasting moral orders, what are they actually favoring? What are we going to get? Because if you favor it, you're going to get more of it. And that is a more fruitful argument than just saying, why in my day, this is how women behave. This is what men did. I mean, that's not going to work. That argument won't work because it's divorced from any rationale for it. On the other hand, most people, I think, would agree, even if they're thoroughly modern, they would be suspect with the idea that we actually are going to privilege the selfish over the selfless, or the uncommitted over the committed. I mean, most people would find that a little bit unsavory, even if they're not Christians. I mean, you can look at that and say, well, we really don't want to privilege the healthy, wealthy, beautiful, and strong. Let's get the opposite of the healthy, wealthy, beautiful, and strong, because that's what our dating scene does now, okay? Think of the exact opposite in the dating scene. Well, but how would we protect on the total other end of the spectrum? It would be arranged marriages, wouldn't it? In other words, we're not going to ask you who's the most beautiful, go after her. Your parents know better. Or the local matchmaker knows better. Or AI will know better. Anybody knows better than you. You don't know what you're talking about. So in other words, in that case, you are trying to match people based upon what? Well, once upon a time, it was based upon, a lot of it was very cynical. It's keeping wealth together and all of that kind of stuff. But it's trying to find people who will be compatible rather than just sexually attracted with one another, and people who will form good families and that sort of thing. And that might not mean always picking the healthiest, the wealthiest, and so forth. So you have a chance if there's some kind of a mechanism in society to make sure every man gets paired with a woman. You have a chance. But in our society, it's very difficult if you're not driving around a nice car with a nice suit and you're not the most handsome person in the world. Okay, so I'm not so much saying that we should go back to arranged marriages, although I think I could make a much better argument for arranged marriages than how we do things now. That would be preferred. Okay? Even though, will it result in some unhappiness? Yes. Does our present system result in some unhappiness? Yes, it does. Okay? So we're really not talking about what works and what doesn't. We're going to say, how disastrous is it and for whom? Okay? Because arranged marriages will be disastrous for some people. It'll be very good for others. But our modern meat market is disastrous for a lot of people. Okay? Okay, let's talk about the regulation of morality. Because you've heard that you can't regulate morality, can you? Well, legislation is a kind of regulation, and that's the point. Okay. Morality is regulated all the time. Sexual morality and otherwise. So we're going to talk about how societies regulate morality. They do. They do routinely. So does our society. So it's which morality you're trying to in place. Okay, and let's start with the one that causes all the problems, and that's that, where we're talking about laws. Okay? Understand something about laws. Good laws are almost unnecessary. When we're talking about the regulation of morality, good laws are almost unnecessary. How come? Most criminal laws, that's hardcore regulation of morality, nobody's going to argue with them. They may do them anyway, but not because they disagree with it, but just because they want what they want. However, once it gets to a law, usually you have an almost universal acceptance of the basic moral principle. Okay? And you'll have some exceptions today because morality is changing. But nevertheless, in general, if you want to pass a law, usually, if you think that will be worthwhile, the deed is already usually done. So the purpose for passing a law might be to punish those who still go outside what is universally accepted. Okay? So you might want a law even though everybody agrees that pedophilia is bad. You might want a law against it anyway because it's so bad we want to be able to punish you and punish you a lot if you do this. Okay? Even though we're not going to use the law in order to convince people not to do this, because the people who are going to do this aren't paying attention to the law. But if we catch you, we are going to use this law to really get you. Okay? So that would be a good reason. Here is not a good thing. You don't like the way things are going in society, so you try to pass a law to forbid it. So we look around and we see people are just moving in with one another. They're not getting married. We need to stop that. Let's pass a law. What would happen if we pass a law forbidding cohabitation? It wouldn't pass. Well, there'd be easy to get around this. And then, of course, it would be like many laws where nobody agrees with it. If nobody agrees with it, what do? Well, they just don't enforce it. They just don't do it. Okay? So if you just don't enforce it and don't do it, it's the laws on the book. Who cares? So if our desire is to cause people to get married before moving in with one another, The first step is not to pass a law. In fact, that would be the last step, and a step that may never need to be taken at all, because actually, once you get to the point of the law, okay, if that's something that would really fit our society, you've pretty well won the game already, okay? And then the only reason why you would need a law in that case is to protect certain people in certain circumstances. But in general, you don't need laws. You don't need criminal laws. You don't need civil laws to do what people already believe is right or wrong. So what we're talking about in the regulation of morality is what people believe is right and wrong. And if people think something is wrong, they have many ways of discouraging it. And the least important of them is laws. So let us not get lost in the where we just feel like as Christians we can't do anything because we can't pass these laws, and even if we did, what good would it do? The answer is, right, it wouldn't do any good, and we couldn't pass them anyway, so let's forget that. That's not where the battle is going to be won or lost. That's not where the present battle was lost, in the laws. Okay, reputation is very, very important to people, believe it or not. Even people with bad reputations have good reputations in some circles that they care about, okay? It's just like the person who has all these tattoos. And you say, why would you put tattoos all over your face like that? Don't you realize it's going to make it impossible for you to get hired anywhere? I mean, you've destroyed your reputation. Well, why did they do that then? Because it enhanced the reputation, but not with the people you want, but with other people. Reputation is very important. That's why peer pressure is so vitally important. That's why children learn what they learn on the playground, because they're trying to please one another. And before that, they're trying to please their own moms and dads. Okay? Nobody has to punish anybody. All you got to do is give a pat on the back or a frown. And most moral regulation is accomplished right there. It's what the people around you that you care about, what they value, what they don't. And it is a pretty rare person who really doesn't care. Okay? Now they maybe screw it all up, and once they screw up their reputation, then they say, well, I don't care, because they've just busted it all to so many pieces it can't be repaired anymore. But it isn't true that they didn't care. It just means it's wrecked now. So you might as well make a silk purse out of a sow's ear and pretend it doesn't matter. But reputation matters a lot. It matters when you're a little kid. It matters when you're a teenager. It matters when you're all grown up. It matters when you're old. It matters throughout our life. Nobody likes to have a bad reputation. Everybody wants a good reputation. So reputation is the key thing for regulating morality. Okay? Again, forget laws. It's reputation. That means that central in regulating morality, it's not all negative, I'll get to the positive here, but shame and stigma. Now, before you think that I'm talking about, driving people out of into the woods to live in the woods because we won't have them, or the scarlet letter idea, okay? Shame and stigma come in lots of different forms. I mean, from very mild disapproval to, yes, we're going to drive you into the wilderness and banish you forever, okay? Shame and stigma is just a way we're going to talk about reputation. When your father frowns at you because you didn't seem to be working hard enough on your homework, you don't get spanked. Nothing happens. But you realize that you've disappointed your father. Okay, that is huge. Does that make you feel ashamed? Yes. Yes, it does. And that will do more to cause kids to work hard on their homework than anything else. What if you have parents that don't care? Parents that don't care whether you do your homework or not. Well, maybe the kid happens to be in a class where they really value the teacher. Okay? So they may look up to the teacher, and the teacher frowning because they didn't do very well might be a substitute for the parents. Then again, it might not. The teacher might find this totally losing battle trying to get the kids to value doing their homework because it's obvious that at the home, this is not valued. Okay? Talking back to adults, for example. I mean, the first time you get whacked upside the head doing that, you just don't forget that. And those kinds of stigmas and those kinds of things that we learn in childhood stay with us, whether we respect authority or not, whether we treat the opposite sex with appropriate respect or not. All of these things were learned growing up through an infinite number of little shames and little stigmas, little disciplines and training, most of which had nothing to do with corporal punishment or being sent to your room without. It's just, I disappointed somebody I look up to. Okay? But it can get more than that. You're fired. That's pretty harsh. That's pretty shameful. I got fired from my last job. How come? Because I cheated. Ooh. Okay, so we don't like to be fired, and we don't like to be publicly humiliated. Public humiliation is the kind of shame that any adult wants to avoid if they can all avoid it. Think how many behaviors, there's no law against it, but nobody does it, okay, just because it would be embarrassing. It's embarrassing. So society has a way of not just communicating what we like and don't like, but making people really want to conform. And it's all built around not just shame and stigma, but shame and stigma are important. If you take away shame and stigma, how else are you going to get people to do what they don't want to do? Well, yeah, so let's talk about that. You also have honor and approval. It's not just trying to avoid the negative. It's also trying to gain the approval of whom? People we value. So it's our peer group, it's our parents, it's our family, it's people we look up to. When they approve, that makes you feel good. It's the opposite of shame. And so we want to know what the people around us whom we admire, what they approve of and what they admire so that we can do it. No punishments. Can be very formal. You get a nice raise. Okay? Sometimes it's economic benefits. Sometimes it's privileges that you will gain in society, because I remember in high school I had a good reputation as opposed to some kids that had a bad reputation. Okay? If I was caught in the hallway without a hall pass, do you know what happened to me? Nothing. But the poor jerk next to me, he gets caught the same, and he goes to the office immediately. How come? Because he's got a bad reputation and I had a good one. Now, will I keep my good reputation once it find out that I'm wandering the halls for the same bad reasons that this other kid is? No, I won't. So, I mean, if you care about your reputation, you won't take advantage. If you do take advantage and you get caught, you lose your good reputation, and that means that your freedom to move around is more restricted, because every single time I do anything, the teachers are watching because they know. Okay? So in our society, we have a lot of professions that rely upon us, relying upon the occupiers of these professions to be of high character. This is why we get so upset at crooked cops. Cops have an enormous amount of authority. And you can't watch them every day all the time. And you don't want to have to. Anybody you have to watch all day, all the time, you don't want to be a cop. So there's somebody where we invest a lot of trust in, and that kind of honor that we place on that kind of person, if it is abused, we come down very hard on. Okay? So that's the opposite of the honor, is the extra stigma and the extra shame that comes when you abuse that. Okay? So people who are given privilege and freedoms are expected to live up to that, and when they don't, we come down exceptionally hard on them. So who is it as a society that we look up to? And who do we emulate? Who do parents point to their children to and say, be like that person? Be like your uncle so-and-so, or be like this or that person on TV, or this or that, athlete, or whoever it happens to be. Be like them because see what class they have. Say he's a world-class athlete and he just lost. But look at the sportsmanship he is demonstrating. Be like that. And you don't even have to be, you normally are not actually going to be that explicit about it. It's just that kids see what their parents look up to. They see what the adults in the world look up to. They watch the TV and they get examples of what apparently our society emulates. This is part of the problem with television and our popular culture, because our popular culture is having a monstrous, huge, and terrible effect on the raising of our children, because there's just so many awful examples of, yeah, that's a person, but that is not somebody I would emulate, but they're famous. And everybody seems to be looking up to them. And how do you fight that? You can, but it's an uphill battle. So we honor and approve certain people and hold them up for examples. We give monetary rewards to people that we think are reliable and do a good job and all of that kind of stuff. And the people who don't, we don't pay as much, or we don't pay at all. We just fire them outright. And it just feels right when a good person does well. And it feels wrong when a bad person does well. Do you agree with that? It does. It happens. But it's always nice, at least even when it happens, that we recognize it as an aberration. Okay? What we'd like is a society where the right people get exalted to the right places and the wrong people don't. And when that doesn't work that way, then, it seems unjust and wrong and upside down. And I've talked before about social privilege. The fact that people look up to you is presumably based upon your reputation. That people look up to you for a reason, because of what you've actually done, that they know you've done, or what other people have said you've done, or what other people say you're like. And they should be desirable qualities before we're looking up to people. Okay? You're all being very quiet. I'm talking. I'm going to stop talking now, so you're going to start chiming in. What do you think? The regulation of morality. Will this do it? Well, there's no other way to do it. Okay. Yes?
What about education?
Well, of course, education is the factory where all this shame and stigma and honor and approval are day by day. In parenting is the same thing. And the playground, let us not forget, as well as the neighborhood kids and the coworkers, okay? So let's go back to the simple problem, okay? We've got too many people that are living together and having children, they're not married. We can pass a law, but we all know that that's not going to work. In order to stop this, or even to slow it down, what has to happen? You got the solution.
Yeah. You have children and teach them that the purpose of life is marriage and a family, and not your job or your status or things that are fading.
All right, so obviously it's got to start there. Okay, because if parents communicate to their children that these things aren't important, it's going to be hard for the rest of us to communicate to that child, well, actually, it is. And parents who raise their children properly to understand what life is actually about, how to comport themselves, and why they should comport themselves that way, are much more resistant to the temptations in the world. Study after study after study has shown that although peer pressure is very important with kids, and whether they're going to smoke or do drugs or have sex and whatnot like that, the studies also show not to downplay the importance of parents, their own parents. If the parents have taught their children well and have lived it themselves, right, then that doesn't guarantee that the child isn't going to go off the deep end because they're tempted by the siren song of their peers. But you've given them hope, and it is quite possible that they will stand alone against the tidal wave of what everybody else is doing. So it begins with, well, how we raise our own children. Okay? Of course, this becomes very difficult if parents divorce for any reason, every reason, and no reason at all. And if all of your friends, their parents, are divorced for any reason, every reason, and no reason at all, if they were ever married. If a child grows up in a world where marriage just seems to be kind of a thing that some people think is good and they do it for a little while, this is really hard. That perpetuates itself. Well, yes.
Well, back to your question, how do you change it? And history's proved that basically a society doesn't change until it's hit rock bottom, and the people finally understand that all of your, starting at the top, marriage doesn't mean squat, fidelity doesn't mean this, and it has finally imploded. That's when society, because you look at history, it's been an up and down. It hits the rock bottom and they go, whoa, this lifestyle, this morality that we have created, it doesn't work. It has created us problems. That's when it relies on the ones that have held strong to, as God would say, the morality He expects. Then the society goes along, okay, let's lurch that way, and it does. It becomes very, very good. Look at American society. I recall back in the 50s, everybody was in church on Sunday. There were a few didn't, but that was just the way it was.
Which, by the way, didn't mean they were all believers, but it did mean that was a socially acceptable thing to do.
Exactly, and I can recall, my friends, there in the 60s was when some of that wife swapping stuff came out. And some of the parents, did that. Everyone knew, Bishop Small, the children, they were so stigmatized and ashamed of their own parents, and it really affected them the rest of their life because that went against society, that went against stuff. But nowadays, they don't even think about it.
Well, that's correct. And think about how important this is. Moral regulation is very difficult to do on your own, just by yourself. If you are the only one that thinks this way, it is very difficult to withstand the temptations, okay? Which is why parents are really important in not only having a child and raising a child, but maybe having several children and raising all of them, because parents will go on supporting the children, and the siblings will support one another. Okay? That's really important. But what about the parents? They need support too. So it's very difficult for two parents who have decided to commit themselves to raising moral children, and they're the only ones in their world that think that way, okay? It's not impossible, I suppose, but it is difficult. Churches have become, or at least faithful churches have become, like the last bastion of moral common sense anymore. You're just not going to get any support anywhere else, because everywhere else you go, the primary concern is, your personal well-being, and we can't force one another. That's the key. You can't force one another to, live a particular way. You can't force your religion or your morality on somebody else. And that people say that, and it's a canard, it's another axiom, but it's totally false. Of course you can. We do it all the time. That's what we're talking about here. That's what schools do. That's why I'm very, very concerned about what happens in our schools now, because schools have a profound impact on what they're encouraging kids to do or discouraging kids to do. And kids are put in an environment where they're surrounded by all of these other kids and teachers and so on. And if they are teaching a morality totally adverse to Christian morality, it's difficult to expect the kids to hold up against that. So churches become, I think, a very important part of this, because I don't know of another institution in our society today that actually thinks about these things and takes moral principled stands on anything. That is, anything that, any of this common sense we're talking about. In churches, for example, let's put it this way. I think among Christians we need to start with ourselves. We do not start with trying to change society. But we must start with ourselves. In the same way that parents who try to raise, if you want to raise your children not to smoke and you smoke, we all know what that does, okay? It's kind of a waste of time. And everybody knows that. And so parents have to practice what they preach. Churches have to practice what they preach, which doesn't just mean the preacher. Everybody has got to. Now, that doesn't mean that there's, no room for mistakes. I mean, the church is all about forgiveness, and that's part of the thing that we practice. But forgiveness requires what? Yeah, repentance. You can't have forgiveness where there's no sin. If somebody doesn't agree that they've sinned, then how is it meaningful to talk about forgiveness? So in church, we have a way of dealing with human error, sin, rebellion, and so on. It's a constructive way, but it doesn't just overlook the problem. But the truth of the matter is, just as parents who want to raise faithful children got their work cut out for them because their children naturally are going to be pulled in all kinds of different ways, so also in the church, we have our work cut out for us because we are all immersed in the world being tugged all kinds of different ways. So we need one another. Just as children need their siblings and their parents to support them, the parents and the children need a church to help and support them. Now, we are not going to be persuasive to the world outside the church if we ourselves are not practicing these same things. We're just simply not. And we are on a fool's errand if we think that if we just do it right amongst ourselves, the whole world will be transformed. It isn't. Our goal should not be to transform the world into a nice moral place where everybody does what they're supposed to do. But it should be a place where at least we Christians know what we're supposed to be doing and why we're supposed to be doing it, and we at least ourselves are faithful to it. Okay? We can be a witness to the world, and some people will listen. You don't have to be a believer to understand the value of a lot of Christian moral principles. You just don't have to be a believer to see the wisdom of this. But they're not going to see anything if we ourselves are not practicing that, which means that Christians within churches need to be conscientious for how they live. We need to raise our children to be conscientious for what life is about and how they live. And then in our witness to the rest of the world, we need to be consistent. The reason why I would oppose, or I oppose sexual libertinism in our culture is not because I want to impose my morality on them. It's because of what I understand human life to be. And when I say that, I don't mean human life for a Christian. I mean human life for any human being. So if I love my neighbor, my unbelieving neighbor, I'm going to want to support them in those things which I know will help human flourishing. And I will want to discourage those things which I know will redound to human suffering. It has nothing to do with forcing them to believe like I believe. It just has to do with acting consistently with what I know is true. If this is what a human being is, then I cannot support this kind of libertine approach. It is contrary to what a human being is. If I believe that a human being is a biological mass that has just evolved over time, that would be a different matter. I don't believe that. And I won't act that way. I won't talk that way. I won't vote that way. I will act and vote and support according to what I think the truth is. And that is that God has created us for something greater than just being happy. All right, let's pray. Lord Jesus, we thank you for the truths that you've given to us. Especially, Lord, we thank you for your precious gospel, for the revelation of your own love for us, which gives us hope in this world. Help us as your people, Lord, to bear witness to you and to bear witness to the life that God has called us to, that human beings may flourish in order to glorify you. Help us, Lord, to lead the way because we have the light and the truth. Lead us, O Lord, by your Holy Spirit and with the wisdom of your word. Amen.